My name is Diane Adams. I am 38 years old, and the letter that ended 11 years of my life arrived in a certified envelope, addressed to me by the wrong name. Not Adams. Not even Wren, my late husband's name, which I never took. They spelled it Diane. 2 N's. A name I've never gone by, on a document that would reclassify my entire professional existence, retroactive to the day my husband stopped breathing in the parking structure of the building we both worked in. I stood at my front door in Ireland with the envelope in my hand for a long time. The mail carrier had already turned the corner. The sprinklers on the neighbor's lawn were stuttering through their cycle. The letter was signed by my brother-in-law, Carter Wren. The CC line included my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, and a law firm I didn't recognize, which meant they'd hired outside counsel specifically for this. They'd thought of everything, except how to spell my name. That was the moment I understood exactly what I was dealing with. If you've ever had someone use your silence against you, if you've ever been the person in the room that everyone underestimated, I want you to stay with me through this one. Hit like before we go further, and subscribe if you're new. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. I should tell you about David, not who he was at the firm, though that mattered, but who he was at 6 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in his socks, reading case notes on his tablet with a cup of coffee going cold beside him because he kept forgetting it was there. He was operations director at Wren Medical Group, the specialty clinic network his father, Edmund, had spent 30 years building from a single orthopedic practice in Sugar Land into a 12-clinic operation stretching from Houston to the Woodlands. David was meticulous, warm, deeply capable. He'd inherited his father's ambition without the accompanying need to control everything around him. I came to Wren Medical as a contractor 7 years ago. A mutual contact connected me to Edmund after a regional healthcare compliance conference. I'd given a presentation on billing audit risk, and apparently Edmund sat in the third row taking notes on a legal pad like a man who had just learned something he hadn't expected to need. He called me 2 days later. I thought it was a one-quarter engagement. I never left. Inside the first 18 months, I restructured their revenue cycle management, renegotiated 2 payer contracts, and caught a $2.1 million coding discrepancy in their cardiology billing that would have triggered a federal audit if it had surfaced during a review. I know that sounds clinical. What it felt like was pulling a thread until the whole sweater stopped unraveling. Edmund stood in my office doorway, a converted conference room I'd claimed with a folding table and 3 monitors, and said, "I've been doing this 30 years and nobody caught that." He said it like it surprised him. It surprised me that it surprised him. I married David 14 months after I started. I want to be clear about the timeline because people always assume the work came from the marriage. It was the other way. I was at the firm first. The equity conversation, the promise of a partnership stake after 5 years of full-time engagement, that came from Edmund in writing 2 years before David and I were engaged. I have the letter. I kept it in the front pocket of a leather portfolio David gave me when I transitioned from contractor to full-time staff. My name was debossed on the cover in gold. Diane Adams. He'd had it custom made. It embarrassed me slightly, and I loved it entirely. The Wren family home in River Oaks was the kind of house that felt expensive before you could name why. 12-foot ceilings, original hardwood. Every surface in neutral that had been selected by someone paid a great deal to select neutrals. Edmund's wife, Sylvia, hosted Sunday dinners there with the methodical warmth of someone who had learned hospitality from a book and then practiced it until it looked natural. She called me Diane, darling, and remembered my food preferences, and once sent me flowers when I had a difficult quarterly close. She loved me the way certain women love efficiency, deeply, conditionally, and without quite realizing it was conditional. At Christmas parties, I was David's wife who handles the numbers. In financial reviews, I was the one in the room nobody introduced. Edmund would present my models to outside stakeholders and say things like, "Our analysis shows," and gesture broadly at the slides I'd built from scratch at 11 o'clock the night before. David used to squeeze my knee under the table when that happened. Just once. A single press. His way of saying I see it, and I'm sorry, and I can't fix it right now. He died 8 months before the letter arrived. Cardiac event, the medical examiner said, as if giving it a formal name made it less abrupt. He was 41. He'd been complaining about fatigue for 3 weeks, and we both assumed it was the Q3 push. I was in a meeting with our compliance team when his phone went to voicemail. By the time I reached the hospital, there was nothing left to do but sit in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee and understand that my life had just split into a before and an after, and I was now permanently on the wrong side of that line. The portfolio stayed on my desk. I didn't move it for 6 weeks. Edmund called me 2 weeks after the funeral, not to discuss the business, or so he said. He wanted to check in. That was his phrase, check in. He had a gift for making supervision sound like affection. How are you holding up? He asked. His voice had a particular quality on the phone, lower than in person, more deliberate. Like he was choosing each word from a prepared list. I'm managing, I said. Which was true, in the way that all insufficient things are technically true. Good. Good. We're going to take care of you, Diane. David would want that. I noticed he said David would want it. Not that he wanted it. I filed that away, without quite meaning to. The equity letter, the one from 2019, the one with his signature, guaranteed me a 4% stake in the Wren Medical Group upon the completion of 5 years of full-time service. I'd crossed that threshold 14 months before David died. I let it drift. I trusted the letter. I trusted David. I trusted the family I had married into. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it matters. Not the naivete. I don't think I was naive. I think I made a calculation that 11 years of demonstrated competence inside a family business earned a kind of relational equity that supplemented the legal kind. I thought that when you catch someone's $2.1 million mistake and say nothing publicly, you have purchased something. A certain safety. A certain acknowledgement. I was wrong about what I'd purchased. What I'd actually purchased was their comfort with my silence. 6 weeks after Edmund's call, a private equity firm called Aldridge Capital filed preliminary paperwork on a potential acquisition of Wren Medical Group. I found out from a news alert. Not from Edmund. Not from Carter. From a push notification on my phone while I was eating a salad at my desk. I set the fork down very carefully. I opened the equity letter in my portfolio and read it twice. And then I went back to work because that was what I always did, and because I needed them to believe that nothing had changed. The first meeting I wasn't invited to happened on a Tuesday. I knew about it because I booked Edmund's conference room. I handled his calendar, not as an assistant, but because our work overlapped enough that it was more efficient than asking someone else to do it. When the Aldridge prep session appeared on the calendar with a restricted attendee list, I noticed my name wasn't on it. I assumed it was an oversight. I sent a calendar request. It was declined without explanation. The second meeting I wasn't invited to happen the following Thursday. Same room. Same restricted list. My request was declined within 4 minutes, which meant someone was watching. My building access, I discovered this slowly, the way you discover a slow leak, had been quietly reclassified. I could still access the Galleria office, but 3 internal servers I'd maintained for years now required a permissions request. The requests went to Carter's assistant. She was apologetic in a practiced way that suggested she'd been told what to say. Carter himself was warm when we passed in the hallway. That was the thing about Carter. He was warm the way certain rooms are warm, meaning the heat is coming from somewhere you can't quite locate. He had David's coloring but not David's openness, and he managed the gap with a particular kind of corporate friendliness that asked nothing and revealed nothing. He'd been resentful of David since before I arrived. I'd always known that. What I hadn't fully understood was that David had been the buffer between Carter and me, not intentionally, just structurally. David's presence created a context in which I was wife of a principal. Without him, I was reclassifiable. The due diligence dinner happened on a Friday night in late March. The Aldridge Advance team, 3 partners and their lead analyst, flew in from Chicago. Edmund booked the private room at a restaurant in the Galleria that had leather banquettes and a wine list presented in a leather folder, because Edmund understood that certain deals are made with the senses before they're made with the numbers. I was seated at the far end of the table, between 2 clinic directors who were newer than I was and visibly uncertain why they'd been included. I understood why. The table needed bodies. It needed to look like Edmund had a team. I was one of the bodies. Edmund introduced me to Aldridge's lead partner, a man named Bryce, silver-haired, the kind of man who always looked faintly disappointed by the present moment, as Diane, who's been with us through a very difficult year and has just been invaluable to the family. Invaluable to the family, not to the firm. Not as a forensic accountant with 11 years of institutional knowledge. To the family. Like a housekeeper. Like someone who had brought casseroles. Bryce nodded once and wrote nothing in his notepad. I smiled and asked him how the flight from Chicago had been. I ate my dinner. I made conversation with the clinic directors. I watched Edmund work the table with the effortless authority of a man who has never once doubted that the room belongs to him. Carter sat to Edmund's left and laughed at the right moments and refilled Bryce's water glass without being asked. On the drive home, I sat in traffic on Westheimer for 25 minutes. The radio was off. I had my hands at 10 and 2 the entire time. I was thinking about metadata. I want to stop here for a second, because I know some of you are watching this and you've been in that dinner. You've been the person at the end of the table. The one they introduced wrong or didn't introduce at all, or introduced in a way that made 11 years disappear into a single soft sentence. Tell me in the comments, what did you do? Did you say something? Did you wait? I want to know. Because what I did next took everything I had, and I'm still not sure most people would have done it the same way. I have a habit, and I have always had it, that the people around me tended to find either reassuring or slightly unnerving depending on their relationship to documentation. I keep copies of everything. Not defensively. Or, at least, not originally. It started as professional practice. A forensic accountant without a paper trail is just someone's opinion, and over 11 years it had become infrastructure. Version histories. Email threads. Submission timestamps. Original files with embedded metadata showing the author, the creation date, and every revision. David's name appeared on my work in exactly one place. A Year 3 project portfolio I had handed to Edmund in person. When I requested a copy of that portfolio from our document management system, what came back had David listed as the primary author on the cover sheet. I compared it to my original. Someone had done it manually. The font on his name was 0.5 points larger than the rest of the text, not enough to notice unless you were looking, which is how I knew it was deliberate. Careless deliberateness. The worst kind. I retained an attorney in Dallas, not Houston. I drove up on a Saturday morning, told no one, and sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a building on Ross Avenue with a woman named Patricia who had been doing employment and equity litigation for 20 years and had the kind of stillness that came from having heard everything. I showed her the equity letter, the metadata, the cover sheet discrepancy. She read through everything twice without speaking. Then she said, "How much of this do they know you have?" "None of it," I said. She nodded. "Good. Let's keep it that way." I drove back to Houston that evening. I stopped in Beaumont to have dinner with my mother. Diane Adams had worked 30 years at the post office. She could sort and triage faster than anyone I'd ever met, in work and in life. We ate at her kitchen table, the one she'd had since I was 9, with the water stain on one corner that she'd stopped trying to hide sometime in the mid-90s. She watched me eat without saying much. When I stood to clear the plates, she said, "You're not sad anymore. That means you're working." I didn't confirm or deny it. I kissed her on the forehead and drove back to Ireland in the dark. The leather portfolio went into my bag the next morning. My name caught the light when I opened it. I left it open on the passenger seat the whole drive in. The Aldrich final walkthrough was scheduled for a Wednesday at 2 o'clock in Wren Medical's top-floor conference room. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The Houston skyline spread out behind Edmund like something he'd arranged himself. The firm's name was etched into the glass doors. The room smelled faintly of cold brew and new carpet, and the particular quality of recycled air in buildings where everything costs more than it should. I had been included on the meeting invitation. That surprised me. Then I realized they needed the numbers person in the room. They needed the person who could answer technical questions about the financial models. They needed me there to be useful, just not to be seen. Edmund opened at 2:15. Bryce and his 3 partners were already seated, tablets out, the particular alertness of people who fly business class and bill by the hour. Carter sat to Edmund's right. I sat against the wall, in a chair slightly separated from the main table. Not at it. I let Edmund get 12 minutes in. He was on the equity table slide, the slide I had originally designed, now stripped of my formatting and reattributed to the firm's internal finance team, when I set my bag on the floor, took out the leather portfolio, placed it on my knees, and raised my hand. The room shifted. Not dramatically. The way rooms shift when something unexpected enters them. A slight recalibration of attention, a subtle turning of heads. Edmund stopped mid-sentence. He looked at my hand, then at my face. He smiled. The smile was very good. Diane. Edmund. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to flag a document discrepancy before we move further into the equity section. I'll be brief. The word discrepancy did a particular thing to the room. Bryce's analyst uncapped his pen. Of course, Edmund said. His voice had not changed. His voice never changed. That was what made him effective and, I now understood, dangerous. I stood. I opened my tablet to the Project Portfolio Index, the complete list of financial deliverables submitted to Wren Medical Group over 11 years, with file creation dates, author metadata, and submission records. I walked to the presentation screen, not asking, just walking, and connected with the adapter already in the center of the table. The equity table currently before you attributes the firm's primary financial modeling work to the internal finance team, I said. I want to show you where those files originated. I went through it methodically, not quickly. The way I'd flagged billing discrepancies for 11 years, calmly, specifically, without editorializing. The 2019 compliance restructuring. Author metadata, Diane Adams, March through September. The payer contract renegotiation models. Author metadata, Diane Adams, all 8 documents. The Aldrich acquisition financial projections. The models currently open on the partners' tablets, the ones Edmund had been presenting as the firm's internal work. Author metadata, Diane Adams, January through March of this year. I heard Carter shift in his chair. I didn't look at him. I set the tablet down and opened the leather portfolio. In year 3 of my engagement, I submitted a comprehensive project portfolio to Edmund directly. I took out the original, my copy, not the one in the document management system. The version currently on file has been altered. This is the original. You'll notice the cover sheet. I placed it on the table in front of Bryce. He picked it up. His lead partner leaned over to look. Nobody spoke. You'll also notice the equity letter signed by Edmund in 2019, which is in the back section. I turned to the last page before Bryce could get there. This guaranteed a 4% partnership stake after 5 years of full-time service. I completed that tenure 14 months before my husband died. The stake was never formalized. Following David's death, my status was reclassified retroactively. The room was very quiet. Edmund said, Diane, I think we should discuss this privately. We should, I agreed. I have an attorney available for that conversation at your convenience. Her contact information is in the portfolio as well. I closed the portfolio. I looked at Edmund for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction. I just looked at him. He was 67 years old, and he had built something real, and he had let it make him afraid of losing it, and that fear had made him capable of this. I understood it. I didn't forgive it. Thank you for the opportunity, Edmund. I mean that genuinely. I picked up my bag. I walked out of the conference room, through the glass doors with the firm's name etched in them, and to the elevator. When the doors closed, I stood very still and breathed. The elevator smelled faintly of someone else's coffee. I went home. Stay with me. Because what happened after I walked out of that room is the part that I think about the most, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so much quieter than anyone expected. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done differently? And keep watching, because what happens in the next 10 days changes everything. Aldrich paused the acquisition within 48 hours. I know this because James called me. James Fola, former colleague, now at a competing consultancy, and the man Aldrich had brought in as their outside auditor. He and I had worked together years before, when we were both junior staff at a regional firm in Austin, and the most exciting part of our jobs was finding other people's rounding errors. He was the one who'd pulled me aside in the Galleria parking garage 3 weeks earlier to tell me what the internal memo said. He'd refused to co-sign it. That wasn't something he told me directly. I found out later from his assistant, who mentioned it without understanding what she was saying. They flagged the documentation review as a material issue, he said on the phone. His voice was careful. He was at his office and conscious of who might be nearby. Carter's submission is under scrutiny. Bryce's team is doing their own metadata audit now. How long do they need? Unknown. But Diane, Edmund's people called my managing director this morning. What did they say? They said you had acted in breach of your employment terms, that the materials you presented were proprietary to the firm. I was at my kitchen table. David's coffee mug was still in the cabinet. I hadn't moved it. I don't know why I thought about that in that moment. What did your MD say? He asked them to send the legal basis in writing. A pause. They haven't sent it. 2 clinic directors reached out to me that week. People I'd trained, which meant people who understood what the numbers actually looked like before I touched them. They asked, carefully, deniably, whether I was consulting. I said I was considering it. Sylvia Wren sent flowers. White lilies in a tall vase, with a card that said, thinking of you. Always. The same flowers she sent when David died. I left them on the porch. By evening, a neighbor had taken them. Edmund did not call. He called Carter. Carter called the Dallas attorney's office and was told all inquiries should be submitted in writing. That bought 10 days. 10 days is enough time for the right people to read the right documents. Edmund called me on a Thursday evening, finally. His voice on the phone was different from any version I'd heard before. Not lower, not deliberate. Just tired. Can we talk? Not through attorneys. I thought about it for a moment. Yes, I said. Come here. He came to Ireland on a Sunday afternoon. It was the first time Edmund Wren had been to the house David and I shared. That was a fact I noticed and set aside. He stood at the door in a sport coat and no tie, which for Edmund constituted informality, and I let him in and offered him coffee, and he said yes, and I made it, and we sat at the kitchen table, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He looked at the house the way people look at places connected to grief, carefully, like the objects might mean something he wasn't equipped to read. I won't explain, he said. Go ahead. Aldridge's team was very specific about key person risk. If you were listed as an equity holder and you chose to walk after David, the valuation took a significant hit. Carter advised that restructuring your classification protected the deal, protected the family. Carter reclassified my work and put David's name on it after David died. Edmund was quiet for a moment. The intent was to simplify the documentation. Edmund. I kept my voice level. You used David's absence to take my name off my own work. He wasn't here to push back. He wasn't here to say, I heard his voice and stopped for a second to say her name goes on that. So you did what was convenient. That's not protection. That's just math. He looked at his coffee. Edmund Wren was not a man who apologized easily, not because he lacked conscience, but because his self-image was built so entirely on the idea of a certain kind of integrity that admitting its failure was structurally difficult for him. I watched him find the words. I failed you, he said finally. And I failed David's memory. Yes. What do you need from me? Full attribution on the record. Written. And the equity stake converted at current valuation. I said it the way Patricia had advised, clear, without hostility, as a statement of what was owed rather than a demand. My attorney will be in contact. He nodded. Once. We sat for another few minutes. He finished the coffee. He asked, briefly and without expectation, how I was doing. I told him I was working, which was the truest thing I could say. He left without any of the warmth he usually performed on exits. Just the door, and then the sound of his car on the street, and then quiet. I sat at the table for a while after. David's mug was in the cabinet. The house held the particular stillness of a Sunday afternoon in autumn when the light comes in at a low angle and makes everything look slightly more finished than it is. I was not healed. I want to be precise about that. I was intact. There is a difference, and I'd learned to live in it. 14 months later, I have a corner office on the 18th floor of a Midtown Houston building that smells of real coffee and fresh paint. James made me a partner. My name is on the door. My actual name, spelled correctly, in the same font as everyone else's. My first client engagement after joining the firm was a medical group that competes with Ren in 3 of their existing markets. The work was legal, the billing was clean, and I did not look for an opportunity to do anything but excellent work. I am a forensic accountant, not a weapon. The fact that Edmund had to watch is simply geometry. My mother visited in October. Nadia Adams walked into my office, stood in the center of it with her hands at her sides, and looked around with the same expression she uses when she's assessing a room for structural dignity, a habit from 30 years of government work, where the quality of a space told you something about how seriously the people inside it took their function. She straightened a picture frame on the credenza. She sat down in the chair across from my desk and said, "This is right." That was enough. The leather portfolio is on my desk, open most days because I'm always pulling something from it or putting something back. David's initials are stamped on the interior, small, where he had them added without telling me. I found them a few years ago and left them. It felt right to leave them. It still does. I opened a new engagement file that morning while my mother sat across from me. Client name, scope, timeline. My name in the author field, the way it belongs. Nadia looked out the window at the Houston skyline and said, "You want lunch?" "Yes," I said. I closed the file, picked up my bag, and we went. I've been asked since some of this became known in professional circles, in the way these things become known, whether I regret not speaking up sooner. Whether I should have confronted Edmund the moment I saw the certified letter. Whether my restraint cost me something I couldn't get back. The honest answer is, I don't know. I know what it cost me to stay quiet. I know what I learned while I was quiet. I know that the document I laid on that conference table meant something different because of how long I'd carried it. A confrontation in the parking lot the day I got the letter would have been emotion. What I brought into that room 14 weeks later was evidence. There's a difference, and it matters. What I want to say to you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from, is this: being underestimated is information. It tells you what someone is willing to do when they think you can't see them. And quiet people keep records. We always have. If you're in the middle of something like this right now, something where someone is using your silence as permission, I'm not going to tell you to be patient. I'm going to tell you to be careful and thorough and to keep copies. The rest will come. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're new. There are more stories here, and none of them are gentle. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done when you opened that letter? My name is Diane Adams. I am 38 years old, and my name is spelled correctly in every room that matters.